Where's all the reserved seats?
I don't know. It's
Hello, everybody. Welcome to 192 Books. We are here tonight to celebrate the launch of Everything Is Now, the 1960s New York Avant-Garde, Primal Happenings, Underground Movies, Radical Pop by Jay Hoberman, out from Verso. And Jay will be speaking with Eric Banks. Jay Hoberman, who I'm blocking for the camera right now, by the way. This is going to be live streamed onto YouTube and archived on PCG Studio. Jay Hoberman was for over 3 decades a film and culture critic for The Village Voice. His previous books have explored the subculture of midnight movies, the rise and fall of Yiddish language cinema, the international communist avant-garde, Soho performance art, and the underground filmmaker Jack Smith. His Found Illusions trilogy, which includes The Dream Life, Make My Day, and An Army of Phantoms, use Hollywood to refract the history of the Cold War. And he'll be speaking with Eric Banks, who's the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities. He is a former senior editor of Art Forum and the former editor-in-chief of Book Forum. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the London Review of Books, the New York Times Book Review, 4 columns, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. And he's contributed to monographs and artists including Christopher Wool, Franz West, and Matthew Barney. He is the consulting editor of the Robert Rauschenberg Catalog Raisonné. They'll be speaking about the new book, and there will be a Q&A after, along with an opportunity to purchase the new book. I also want to spotlight this, which is a program curated by Jay Hoberman, starting next Friday at the Anthology Film Archives, and that will be at the counter as well. I'll pass it over to Eric. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I'm so happy to be in conversation with you about this book. It's just so much fun. It's so incredible. Just as a little bit of an introduction, I'm going to steal from the back cover of the Galley, which I don't think is actually reproduced in the flap copy here. But just to give you a sense of the range of this book, the characters who show up in this book range from Albert Eiler, Amiri Baraka, Shirley Clark, Jackie Curtis, Bob Dylan, Allen Ginsberg, Yayoi Kusama, Boris Lurie, Jonas Mekas, Yoko Ono, Namjoon Pike, Barbara Rubin, Ed Sanders, Carolee Schneemann, Jack Smith, Sun Ra, Andy Warhol, and many, many more. Some were associated with specific movements: avant rock, destruction art, Fluxus, free jazz. I love when one of the first times Fluxus comes up, you cite Jill Johnson's article, Fluxus.
I know.
Which is brilliant.
That was a great Voice headline.
Great editor there in The Voice. Free jazz, guerrilla theater, happenings, mimeograph zines, pop art, protest folk, ridiculous theater, stand-up poetry, underground comics, and underground movies. The reason I wanted to recite what was obviously written for copy for potential reviewers, because it's not reproduced on the finish, is just that you managed to get so many people and so many different tendencies and movements and so many things that were related and have not quite been pieced together or puzzled together in quite the way you're able to do it here. And you do it in such a way that's just, it's so smooth and so effortless and really funny. You know, it's one of the things that the book starts in 1958, I think.
Late 58,
with these 3 kind of key moments. The first showing of Pull My Daisy.
Yeah, first there's Kerouac at Hunter College.
Kerouac at Hunter College and Pull My Daisy. Then you also bring in The Connection at the Living Theater and the old Ornette Coleman.
The 5 Spot.
At the 5 Spot, over by Cooper Square.
Yeah.
And you ended in 1972 with basically the first review, the first piece of writing that you ended up contributing to the Village Voice, which was a review of Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures, a later showing of that in 1972, which begins his lifelong career with The Voice. The 3 things that I want to say just before to back those observations up before we start is As Richard Brody talked about in his wonderful piece on the book in the New Yorker online, it's a very slow book to read. It doesn't have anything to do with the writing. It's that you stop so much. And the fact that you can actually Google and have a look at, especially at some of the films that you write about, particularly from the first, half of that decade that's covered.
Writing it was like that also, in the sense that I would do it kind of paragraph by paragraph, because I was always going down rabbit holes.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So, yeah.
Did you? Well, I want to ask you just a little bit about the writing of the book in just a second, but I'd be interested to know if that's your usual way of approaching the actual writing of your books. So we can talk about that in a second.
Well, there's some things are, because in all the history books that I've written, I have to have a chronology.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time working on a chronology, different colored pens, and this and that. So it's like anything to not have to write, to get my chronology. As soon as I get the chronology down, then I can start writing. But the thing is that I don't write chronologically. I mean, I learned to write, as a journalist with a weekly byline. I mean, you can't afford to ever have writer's block, ever.
Right.
I mean, at least, that's the way I saw it. So I always would write the easiest thing first. That was one thing that I learned. And I still have a tendency to do that. Sometimes I think of the lead and the kicker first and then fill it in. But anyway, that's how I did this book. But it was very useful in this book because I would be jumping back and forth. And it enabled me to develop certain through lines, which I wouldn't have thought of at the beginning. If I had begun the book in a linear way, I don't think I would have discovered as much as I did in the writing.
Yeah. It's interesting because I imagine, and this is one of the things I really wanted to ask you about, and that is very much prompted by the reading of the book. How you talk about this in the book. You talk about the fact that you really to start out, you just read every issue of the Village Voice from 1958 to 1972, along with a lot of other underground magazine, underground news.
Yeah, later, and not just read it. I mean, looked at it because I was very interested in the ads and the listings and the placement of things, the letters column, all that.
Yeah. What did you do that at NYU or?
Well, there's a partial, Google Newspapers has part of the Voice up online, which was helpful. And then the rest of it, I went to Butler Library, teaching at Columbia, so I could use their library. So I did a lot of that there.
And they have the physical copies.
No, nobody has the physical. That was my fantasy, to go, and look at the physical copies, which are moldering, but they're around. But the Voice is there's one person. The Voice is a one-person operation now. And so it just was not feasible. I don't know what they did with the bound thing. So but I'm grateful for the University of Michigan or whoever decided to put it on micro.
Yeah. No, I take these first-year students at NYU up every year and show, and among other things, to the New York Public Library, and among other things, they look at back issues of The Voice, mostly from the 80s, but some from the 60s, and they're astonished by them, and I'm astonished to see them again. So when you sat down to do that, really intensive reading through of that entire run, how different was the world that you were reading about how different was that world from the world that you remembered or you thought that this book would reflect? Like how different did the world below 14th Street look to you?
Well,
and from your expectations?
Well, I was born in 1949, so I probably started reading The Voice in maybe 65, 66 when I could find it. I mean, there was only one newsstand in Queens that I knew that carried The Voice. It was in Flushing by the subway, by the one train. So when I would look at some of those, I would remember reading some of the stuff. I would remember actually, articles that I read. In terms of how downtown felt.
Yeah. Like, what did you find? I mean, how different was the way that you thought this narrative would unfold from the one that you sort of discovered during your research? did it surprise you?
Well, I was always discovering things that I didn't know about. I mean, all the way through, coming across, and then, you know, changing to suit that. I mean, just to take one example, I mean, I had a vague idea. I think I'd once heard about the Kerouac reading at Hunter, but I didn't realize that it was on the front page of The Voice. You know, that it was a big deal in The Voice and nowhere else. You know, and that the week before, Roger Shattuck, am I pronouncing his name correctly?
Shattuck, yeah.
Shattuck had actually been written to The Voice and said, but it was being very nice in a kind of vaguely patronizing way, but it was okay. You know, like the only, you know, like representation of this new, you know, like bohemians and this beat thing is in this paper and so on. And that gave me a sense of, you know, like how at least how The Voice understood its mission in that period.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that's how somebody as like totally unlikely and unconventional as Jonas Mekas could get a column there.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, he was unusual from the beginning. You know, Jill Johnston got unusual as she continued writing. She was normal in a way to start.
Well, I was going to talk later about Jill Johnston as a kind of like one of the two or three voices that really, you know, animates the book. Maybe we'll hold off on that for a little bit. But it is remarkable. She, you know, her writing is really is I don't know the best way to put it, but her and Mikas are really the two voices you hear throughout the book, and they give you this kind of chorus of one that's that's really shaping and responding to it. You sort of I mean, if Jill Johnston had not existed, you could not have written this book.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
I mean, Jill Johnston, Jonas. I mean, you know, when Evo got going, it had some wonderfully eccentric and personal writers. I mean, who I was sort of, you know, I was a teenager then. I saw Evo, but I didn't,
That's
you know,
the East Village Other.
Yeah, the East Village Other. But I appreciate somebody like Lil Picard much more now than I would have then. Or Lita Alescu is another one. I mean, you know, they were writers who were sort of in the Voice tradition, but they just took it further in reinventing what journalism could be, personal journalism. I mean, they're like, you know, like blogs, you know, like before the internet.
Mm-hmm.
These writers.
Yeah, yeah, and I think also that the thing that's really interesting, the way that you kind of follow, especially, I mean, Mikas makes sense, and Mikas, you know, Mikas is the voice of experimental theater in a certain period, but Johnson's more of a kind of wild card, and I know I was looking at Marmalade Me today, and I was amazed at how, like, what it was you had. I mean, you can follow in that collection of Village Voice writings what you saw and what is reflected, and there's a lot that's not, and that's the Johnson I always kind of thought of was more of someone who's writing about dance in a way that's not quite as reflected in the book. It's in the book, but there's a different kind of subterranean Jill Johnson that I guess emerges, or what's the opposite of emerges, around 1969 and becomes something
Erupts.
else. Yes.
I mean, she just completely
Derupts.
changed, yeah. And then she had that whole, I mean, it's hilarious. One of the, I'm glad you thought the book was funny, because there are things in it that I just, you know, found irresistible.
Yeah, there really,
mean,
there,
yeah.
no, there really are. I was reading about, I was telling my friend that the other night, I was like, I just kept having different things wanting to tell her. The fact that with the first show, that when Warhol comes to represent the Velvet Underground, that they make their debut at the American Clinical Psychiatric Association meetings.
Yeah.
I mean,
I mean, somebody, you know, somebody who was, you know, the in charge of the conference, you know, who the conference organizer must have thought they were doing, you know, a very hip thing. I mean, my God, you know, like they got much more than they bargained for.
Yes, exactly.
and the fact that, you know, I point this out in the book, that three of the people who were very prominent, I mean, well, Barbara Rubin really kind of made this thing. But Barbara Rubin, Lou Reed, and Edie Sedgwick had good reason to hate shrinks. I mean, they all had been institutionalized as teenagers. Yeah. So, I mean, so there was a certain amount of payback that happened. And then, the other thing I would say is that somebody who I came to appreciate while I was working on this book was Grace Gluck, who was the reporter, the art. She wasn't a critic. In a way, she was much more interesting because she just reported on the art world. And so her description of that event is great. And it's too bad. Seymour Krim, another he wrote about it for the Herald Tribune, but the Herald Tribune I couldn't find that.
Oh, really?
And the Herald Tribune was actually much better written than the Times at that in that period. But
it wasn't
I
around.
digress.
It didn't exist for. It was not. It went out in '63.
I think it became
became
this crazy three-headed thing, and then spun off New York Magazine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sticking to the theme of the humor in the book. Before we get into some of the main themes that I was really thinking about. As it happened, one of the other anecdotes that I think is so funny is the one that when you walk up, you see on the other side of the blackboard, which has to do with it's a long story, but it has to do with a setup to try and get the cops are trying to basically get someone to flip against Ginsburg for selling.
The cops get this
heroin or coke, but it's
no. It was Lemar. Ginsburg, founded Lemar. Legalized marijuana. I mean, and the committee to legalize marijuana, and Ed Sanders was involved in that too, and so, one of the things about the law enforcement, it's both very quaint and totally scary in a way. What was going on with these various official agencies, so they figured that since Ginsburg was he was a well-known guy. He founded this organization that he must be like the biggest pot dealer in New York, and they busted a couple of musicians who may not have known Ginsburg at all, and they threatened them, as they can do. We'll put you away for life. We'll set your bail at $20,000, this and that, but you have to tell us about. They wanted them to flip on Ginsburg. And this guy who has, sometimes there would be people who would turn up, and I was so curious to know what happened to them.
Yeah.
And, they're just lost in history. I mean, there are people who were prominent. I mean, there's an actress, Jean Phillips. I mean, if anybody's ever heard of her, let me know. I mean, there are people like that. But anyway, this guy not only refused to testify, but he got his friends to organize a benefit at the Broadway Central.
Right.
The ballroom of the Broadway Central.
The Heroin Hilton.
Later it became the Heroin. Then they still were having bar mitzvahs there and stuff. But advertised all these people, most of whom didn't show up, but the whole scene was going to be there. And then they made some joke about, how you could, and narcos too, and so then these guys showed up wearing Hawaiian shirts for cover.
Yeah.
I mean, and it gets, and a lot of people got busted, including Jack Smith. Listen, I was very proud to track this down because this is something that I had sort of vaguely heard about, and that Jack Smith continued to talk about, for years afterwards. This big incident, and thanks to the Evo, and another nutty book where people talked about their experience being arrested, and Piero Helixer talks about this. I was able to push, piece this thing together. So it's a scoop.
It's great. It's so funny. I was going to ask you to read it, but I think you just described it so well.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't. Narcs and Hawaiian shirts. That's
right. Yeah. I mean, and then that of course gave Jack Smith, when he wrote about it, he wrote an unpublished, a memoir of this, or description of this, and he just took it, you have to read it. His description is superb.
Well, there's so much Jack Smith in here, and I mentioned to you before, I don't feel comfortable going into Jack Smith because I feel like when I first got to know you, it was when I was at Art Forum and you were working on the Jack Smith show at PS1 in 1996 or so.
Yeah.
And And it's so great and it's so deep that it's almost sort of unfair to the other material, but it's some of the richest material in the book,
Yeah.
and it's incredible how Jack Smith manages to show up basically from page 1 to page 300 or 410.
Yeah, he's a through line.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the other through lines, you mentioned one. It's just this kind of question of legality and illegality that runs through the book. I mean, whether it's about, everyone is a lot of people are busted for drugs at some point. If they're not busted for drugs, they're busted for some kind of tax evasion, or they're certainly busted for not having licenses or for obscenity charges.
Yeah,
Which is something I never could understand when I was like, when I was a kid, I was like, wow, that Lenny Bruce must have been one really funny guy because he was in trouble a lot. I never could figure out exactly what it was he did.
Yeah, the voice description, Stephanie, I think it's Stephanie Harrington wrote about it in The Voice, and her description of the trial is hilarious too, because she points out that these guys, these undercover cops sat there, they were like taping, Lenny Bruce's act, and then they would get a transcription, and then they'd be reading it, in court, and then the DA would be reading it, and she says, like, whatever the terrible words that Lenny Bruce said were like repeated, like 10, 20 times more often in the course of this absurd trial. But the thing is that that New York, I mean, there's an incredible prudishness which existed, in the among the authorities in New York, and that I think it is common that everybody was breaking boundaries in one way or another, and certainly the taboos on language and proper behavior in public and all these certain kind of performances, all these things were real. And what I didn't set out to write a book about censorship. I mean, I was aware of this, and it was always fascinating to me whenever anything was censored. I always wanted to know how that happened. But what I also, I don't consider this a scoop, but I think it wasn't really spoken about enough, was that in 1960, well, there's the whole issue of the New York World's, the 64 World's Fair, which was an illegal World's Fair. I mean, it's so Trumpy in a way that Robert Moses just decided, to give New York a World's Fair. He wanted to do another World's Fair. There were rules, you have to go to this country and that country, and there were legal fairs. No, he was just going to make a New York World's Fair, whether they liked it or not. And then he sort of blackmailed the mayor, Wagner, and the governor, Nelson Rockefeller, into getting on board with this thing, which seemed like a total boondoggle. And it ended up losing money, of course. But one of the things that they decided to do was to clean up the city for the tourists. Clean up New York for the tourists. Probably the very thing that tourists would have been interested to see. So so there was still some burlesque theater. There was still some dime a dance, taxi dance halls. Around 42nd Street, some honky tonk thing. So they got rid of that. But then they started closing down all the theaters that showed underground movies because they weren't licensed. Of course, Flaming Creatures then pushed that to the far side of the moon, and then that was a real legal case. But in general, they were just shutting these theaters down. They were persecuting, the cafe theaters, like Cafe Chino and the other ones. They even shut down,
which were also coffee house, poetry houses.
They even shut down the Metro. La Metro, which was like that was where poets came to read their poetry. It was not such a big deal, and they shut that down too. I mean, there had already been a history of this because there was a big fight in what we call now the West Village, big turf war between the people who lived there, the beatniks who moved there, the people who the urban renewal people. The coffee shop owners. I mean, it was like crazy alliances and stuff going on. So the police were always shutting those places down
this
too.
This was the Carmine DeSapio.
Yes, Carmine DeSapio was although he didn't overtly do it, and he actually came out in support of like folk singers when he realized what way the wind was blowing.
Right.
you know, he supported the folk singers, because they were busted too. They tried to ban folk singing in Washington Square.
Yeah, the story of the Beatnik riot is really great.
Yeah.
They decide that they're going to sing on Sundays, and the cops decide.
Yeah.
And there's a headline in the Times. It's like 300 Beatniks arrested.
No, in the Mirror, which was a tabloid, 3,000 beatniks,
3,000 beatniks,
rioted.
yes.
But no, but this was a typical crazy thing, because, you know, people had been singing in the square since 1945. It was not a big deal.
Yeah.
What I think got to them was that the neighborhood was changing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that there were many more you know, African Americans felt like they could go down to the village too, and
Yeah.
not, you know, so there was a racial thing, there was a sexual thing. I mean, there was a certain amount of cruising that happened in the park. I mean, it was a park in New York City. I mean, it's, you know, so the folk singers became, you know, the focal point.
Yeah.
And Ed Sanders wrote a truly hilarious account of this, in sort of fictionalized but true, in one of his books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing too. I mean, when you talk about, I mean, the sort of tourism cleanup around the World's Fair, because the tourists were really drawn to that area. I mean, you talk about the fact that I think Cafe Bazaar was always
Right.
kind
Cafe
of created
Bazaar,
these,
yeah.
you know, massive traffic
Yeah.
jams through the area.
Yeah.
At one point, they were going to drop. I think they were going to get rid of. They weren't going to allow automobiles to come through the.
Well, they tried various things. I mean, they wanted to make a youth curfew. This is a little later, when you know, teenagers were coming to the West Village. I mean, after, you know, there was a place, the Night Owl, which did a lot of folk rock, and it was open, you know, very, very late, and you had all these kids like me, although I don't think I was there then, but, you know, like coming in from the you know, from Brooklyn, you know, and hanging out, and then, you know, people driving in from New Jersey. I mean, it was hell, you know, for the people who lived there. I mean, that I certainly remember what it was like to be, you know, on McDougal Street on a Saturday night. I mean, you couldn't move.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, so they had reason to be angry. So the city didn't know what to do. I mean, they thought they'd have a curfew for the kids. Maybe they could, you know, they didn't think of it in these terms. Maybe they could have made like a European solution, you know, and had walking streets. But, you know, that was not going to, you know, happen then.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the other great virtues of the book. I mean, and it's all it really until about 1967, and that's the moment that you sort of make the transition from subculture to counterculture in the focus in the book, and thinking about the relationship between basically what downtown was as being a kind of tension between these two sort of, you know, models or kinds of.
Yeah. Well, I think what happens, you know, although it doesn't happen overnight, but the people, you know, artists and the art world gets increasingly politicized.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is always implicit in things, you know, for example, the Living Theater was always political.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were out there, you know, like picketing in Times Square, you know, staging peace marches in 1962, and were involved in a big, you know, sit-in in Times Square a few years later, and then they were being persecuted for not paying their taxes and so on. But I think that a lot of, you know, artists were not particularly political. I mean, you think of somebody like Kerouac is completely apolitical.
Yeah.
You know, and this would have been true, but the conditions under which the degree of legal harassment that they were subject to, then, you know, a kind of recognition of what America was, which I think was you know, inspired by civil rights movement. I mean, I think that had a tremendous effect on people's mentality, and then you know, followed by the war. Effectively politicized the art world, and then, you know, as I, you know, talk about it in the book, it went, you know, like very, it went very far among the gallery artists,
Yeah,
and
handful
so
of
on,
people,
and
yeah.
you know, like attacks on the Museum of Modern Art, and, you know, destruction art, and, you know, there's a kind of delirium which happens at the end of the '60s, and that's certainly part of it. I frankly think that conceptual art is part of this too, even though those artists were not particularly political. Some of them were, but because they did something that seemed so antithetical to the gallery system.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were a few gallerists who got it, but in general, it was making unsellable work, and the attacks on the Museum of Modern Art in particular, were taken. I mean, that was that would not have happened in an earlier generation.
Yeah.
I mean, the painters from the 40s and 50s would not have regarded an attack on the Museum of Modern Art as a particularly, it would have been like very custoristic, to do that.
Well, it's also interesting when the attacks you're talking about, really the later ones from our Art Workers Coalition and some similar and.
Oh yeah, and Black Mask, and
Black Mask.
And even crazier, like manifesting the splinter groups, Jean Tochet, if I'm pronouncing his name right. I mean, Tosh. The E is silent. I thought he put an accent over it. That was just to confuse me, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
He thought of in the future you saying touche.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe what.
Thought.
Yeah, his was when he came up with like the Walloon Liberation Front or something.
Yeah.
It was one of his things. Anyway, there were multiple factions.
Mm-hmm. But the museum was largely kind of absorbed it in some kind of way. And
it's part of its history now. It's fantastic. You can go on their website and you can see all these things that happened. And actually, they kind of realized that at the time, because there was some, I don't remember what group, maybe it was Jean Touche and Ralph Ortiz. I mean, it was some group that went to the front of the Museum of Modern Art and staged this whole thing. I don't know if did they kill a chicken? I don't know. They pretended they did a skit, with.
Yeah, they were going to decapitate chickens.
Well, that was downtown. I don't think they did that uptown, but they did something. They stopped traffic and they did some kind of thing.
Things get classy when you cross 14th Street.
That's right. Yeah. They did something that was it seemed to be some sort of. They made fun of the trustees. I don't know. They did.
Yeah.
Anyway. The cops showed up, as they always would, it was hard, that was, and they said to them, no, it's just theater.
Right.
So they already, were busy assimilating this.
Which can be a kind of motif for so much of what takes place in the book, whether it's kind of someone you don't really necessarily remember so well, or whether it's one of the later theatrical stagings. And I'm not sure exactly even how to characterize something like Che. Was that a theatrical staging?
God.
But there's a certain kind of tension between whether it's really theater or whether it's.
I did see Che because a college buddy of mine was in
You
it.
went to see Che?
I saw Che.
Wow.
I describe it. I mean, I didn't think much of it.
Yeah.
At the time.
Yeah.
But I was, I don't know, 19 years. I was hard to please.
Yeah.
So I mean.
Che was a kind of promise of a. I mean, it's like
well, they were
theater.
promoted that they were actually going to have sex in the, but I don't.
But it was involving Che Guevara and the president of the United States.
Yes, and a nun, and and I mean it was all
four
sorts.
chickens.
And in this storefront theater, which is actually located in the same stretch where the Voice was in Cooper Square.
Oh, Cooper Square. Yeah. Well, talking about that, and one of the things I do want to mention is just how well you start, or how strongly you feel the sense of kind of the different geographical centers and microgeographies of the of downtown between 1959 and 1971. Some of which is, we already talked about McDougal Street. There's the moment that St. Mark's Place suddenly explodes. I mean, where there's a sort of competition between Warhol's light shows and then the Timothy Leary light shows.
Yeah. And they hated each other.
Yeah. And there's a real sense that Timothy Leary's a total, he's the big phony next to Warhol, which is
that's
so
what
bizarre.
I mean. You have Paul Morrissey calling him a phony. I mean, that was that was priceless.
Yeah.
And then the Timothy Leary people, they're like speed freaks.
Right.
They're into the sacrament. I mean, Timothy Leary had actually given a press conference declaring a new religion.
Uh-huh.
I mean, But
It's a good
but
thing
Morrissey, they knew he was like a huckster.
If you start a new religion, it's good to have a press conference to announce it.
Well,
I think
it
that's
certainly
good advice.
happened. I mean, it's not the first religion that got started here that
Yeah.
took off.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, you really bring these kind of areas to life. We were talking beforehand about, I hadn't thought about the slugs in a long time. That bar on,
4th Street.
and like between B and C, which is where
I think between C and D, but maybe B and C.
it's really
it was pretty far
in
east.
the Far East.
It was
as
an
they- as they
adventure
said
to
in
go
the ads.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and where Sun Ra performed from,
And he lived down there too.
and he played every Monday from
Yeah.
from starting at 9 till 4 in the morning
Probably.
without a break,
Yeah, it's conceivable.
without any, and also in the dark.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned him because Sun Ra is one of the great artists of this period.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
no-
he
no-
appears,
no question,
And he appears
yeah.
throughout the book in different,
Yeah.
not in different guises, but
Yeah.
in different contexts.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things, again, that's so great about this book is just how many things get framed and reframed, and people show up in different contexts. I mean, I did want to talk about Barbara Rubin. I hope we can talk about her for a second because she's one of the. She's not a shapeshifter exactly, but she manages to bring together Jonas Mekas, who she's more or less given to, if I
Yeah,
understand your
yeah.
text, as a 17-year-old.
She's sort of like an extroverted Zelig.
Yeah, really.
I mean,
yeah.
she
and then
was.
she has sex with Ginsburg
Yes.
and
She seduced Ginsburg
seduced Ginsburg.
with her movie.
Yes,
You
right.
can-
She
you can
makes
read
a
about
movie
it.
when she's like 19 with her high school friends. That
Her high
was
school
affectionately
friends.
called Cunts and Cocks, but we know it as
Christmas on Earth. She got that from Rimbaud. She got like a. Yeah, no, she was an extremely colorful individual. I mean, even in this world, and she was released from this posh mental hospital in Connecticut. I forget the name now, but the incredible thing is that Edie Sedgwick was there too. They knew each other.
Yeah.
They had to, although they never really acknowledged this, insofar as I know. Although Barbara Rubin used to go up to the factory until she was. They had, I don't know whether they ever chatted about old times, but what's that?
The Institute for Living.
Silver Hill. Yes, that's what. Thank you. Silver Hill. I couldn't. They don't have records. I was curious to see. No, you can't. You can't find out who was there and when and that kind of thing.
And then she introduces Dylan and
Warhol. She introduced. Yeah, she facilitated. First, she introduced Ginsburg to Dylan, and then she introduced probably, I think, maybe. Well, she tried to make a shidduch, with between Dylan and Warhol, because Warhol really wanted, to have a pop star. I mean, one of the other things that I discovered was like how early these, artists were into rock and roll. They used to go out to the Brooklyn Paramount, for these Murray the K shows.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't tell you how insane that is. I mean, Murray the K was the hipster DJ, disc jockey, when I was in junior high school.
Yeah.
I mean, we used to listen to this guy's show. I mean, the idea that like adults were going out there because they recognized, it was like the Ronettes and the girl group kind of thing.
No, it's definitely.
So they're all going out there, and he uses strobe lights too.
Yeah.
And so.
Well, and he tries to get the Velvet Underground to play in Garden
No, they
City.
were rivals. No, they were rival entities.
I thought originally he's kind of tricking them into being.
Oh, no.
Or they paid Warhol like a $40,000 appearance.
No,
fee,
that was not him. That was this guy, John Brockman.
right.
He did tryouts. I'm sorry, we're like skipping around.
Sorry,
It's like
yeah.
the book.
Yeah.
But
It puts you in this kind of mood.
yeah, no, there was a. But anyway, to just go back to Barbara Rubin,
yeah.
she knew that Warhol wanted to make an alliance with a genuine somebody with an album. You know what I mean? And so there were various things. They brought this guy Eric Anderson down to the factory. He was he was a decent folk singer who was playing with the Gaslight or whatever. They brought him down there. They made a movie with him. It's of some interest. It's not one of their best movies. And then when she was friends with Dylan, she brought, and in 1965, my God, I mean, Dylan was like the only person who was, I would say that he was a bigger deal than Warhol.
Yeah.
In 1965, I mean, and so she got him to come down to the factory, and he also knew Edie Sedgwick. I mean, it's like a fascinating story. They're both taken with her, each in his way, and there's a question of who did she know first, and then there's this mysterious guy, Bobby Newworth, who was sort of like Dylan's consigliere. I mean, so she brought Dylan down to the factory to sit for a screen test, which is, if you know what that was what they would do. You would go down there, you would sit in a chair, they would light you in some sort of haphazard way. The camera would be set up. You couldn't move for the 3 minutes that it took. Sometimes there wasn't even anybody there. It was just the camera. I could put a plug in for one of the people who I dedicated the book to, Callie Angel, did a fantastic, catalog raisonné of the Warhol screen test. It's really like a social history of New York in the 60s. It's so good.
Yeah.
Just talking about these, the what's implicit in these 3-minute movies, and so of course Dylan had a terrible time. I mean, this was not his scene at all, and he was not going to fit in there, and so he ended up. It's unclear whether Warhol was going to gift him with one of this silver Elvis, or whether he just saw it and said, "Oh, I'll take this as payment." There are all these people, the different accounts of it, but that's what that was their great.
Yeah.
That was the great meeting, and then Barbara Rubin, had found a great band. She took them down to Cafe Wa, I think, Cafe Wa, Cafe Bazaar, one of them, Cafe Wa, to hear the Velvet Underground, who had been playing in all these mixed media shows. Before that. I mean, they were totally part of the underground scene, and she brought her friends up to them, and they got together, and that's what facilitated the Exploding Plastic Inevitable and this whole other stage in Warhol's development.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, there's another figure who's a little bit like that in the second part of the book, has really surprised me by how present she was and how many different kind of things that came out of her, or how many people she influenced, was Kusama, which is kind of shocking that she manages to link street theater, a lot of laws around obscenity and nudity, public nudity. And then becomes, I think, the first cover artist for Screw magazine.
Well, they used her photographs, and she was actually into that, into calling them up, getting her photographs in the porn magazines. I mean, the thing about Kusama, she's amazing to me. I mean, I really had no sense of her as I remember her from my youth as just being this total inexplicable, exhibitionist. I mean, but it wasn't until I saw Melissa Rackless's show, the Inventing Downtown, that I realized that she had been a painter, and a really, really good painter in my view, and that she was part of that whole 10th Street scene, and then that she made these soft sculptures, right suspiciously close to the time that Oldenburg made his, and she exhibited with Boris Lurie, with that gang, and then I've read her memoir, so I don't know, it's hard to know, whether to take it at face value, but it just seems to me that she blasted out from the art world. I mean, I think that I don't know what what issues she might have had, or I don't know if she suddenly took LSD. What but she just went into this other realm of doing these pretty outrageous street performances, and very very often, and it seemed to me from what I read by reading in the press that sort of she broke a taboo. I mean, it's almost like Warhol was able to get away with stuff that she maybe was not. But on the other hand, she was sort of like integrated into the counterculture.
Yeah.
So that the Evo, the East Village Other, that she's getting written up in The Voice, but totally as a sort of a gossip, crazy thing, but by Howard Smith in scenes. But in the East Village Other, they really like her.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really into what she's doing. And then she tried to take it to another level. She got booked at the Fillmore, opening for Country Joe and the Fish or something like that.
Yeah.
That didn't work.
Uh-huh.
And then soon after that, she went back to Japan and just did another. Her career took a completely different turn.
Yeah. But it's interesting because she's really the point that you start to feel, again, like you're emerging north of 14th Street. She's in all these different contexts. There's one point that she sort of somehow there's like this big Charlotte Mormon parade that she somehow infiltrates.
Yeah,
and
she just
disrupts
crashed it.
And
She crashes it. Yeah, it's very funny.
Anyway.
We're getting the signal to ask for questions.
All right. Well, let's
Yeah.
take some questions.
Yeah.
Who has questions? Do you have a better view on the person with the signals?
I'd love to know how you began conceptualizing this book, how it began as an idea and how you began combining all of this archival work.
How did I begin conceptualizing this book? Well, I have a little joke, that it took me, 3.5 years to write, but really I got the idea for it 50 years ago. And how did I conceptualize it? Well, there was something that I really wanted to do, and without going into the weeds, I would say that it didn't initially appear that the world was just waiting for this. At least that's the impression I got from my agent, and But I went ahead because I wanted to write it. I mean, when you get to a certain age, you I mean, at least for me, it was like a book. I wanted to read this book, so I had to write it. I guess would be one way to do it. And I thought of various ways to do it. And at one point I thought, well, you just, because there's this whole thing. I mean, there's examples, of these sort of generational biographies, of there's the Coenties Slip and 10th Street, 9th Street women, 9th Street, So, to pick like 12 artists, I thought about that, but I didn't, first of all, I didn't like narrowing it down. And then I also thought that I didn't want to, underlying the book was a feeling that I didn't want to be talking about like individual genius. I wanted to be talking about how, like a collective outpouring of things. And so that really, New York is for me, like the protagonist of the book. And that's why I'm so insistent on having all these addresses.
Yeah.
I mean, that also really helped me, think about things, about the geography. And so once I got that idea, then I started going through The Voice and, taking notes, on what was in every issue and started working on a chronology. And there were certain things that I knew that I wanted in here, in part because I had written about them in one way or another. So this is my, my philosophy. Oh, I had done, I could start by incorporating some of this and elaborating on it, and then I've got something done. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how it that's how it evolved.
Verso should think about marketing this as a textbook for history of New York classes. It's really fantastic.
Don't all textbooks have to be vetted in Texas? I mean,
you don't say anything bad about Texas in here, so.
No, that's true. I don't say anything about Texas.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, there are some people I knew personally.
Just to repeat it, he's asking for the people who are watching online.
Yeah.
He's asking if you knew how many of these people you knew personally.
Yeah,
or
I mean, there are some people who I knew personally. I mean, some of them I knew pretty well. I mean, Ken Jacobs I knew pretty well, and some people like Jonas. I certainly knew him for a long time. I can't say that I he's an enigmatic fellow, but I certainly knew him. Michael Snow. I mean, the filmmakers I knew. And then there were people whose work I followed. I mean, Jack Smith, work I followed while he was alive. And, Tony Conrad. I mean, yeah, but it's not like I really hung out with them, or most of what I gleaned either from people who were in one way or another were involved in the scene, and what I read in the papers. And then some people have written wonderful memoirs. And one thing I learned, I mean, Ed Sanders wrote a very, very detailed memoir, in addition to drawing on things, in his fiction. And one thing I learned is that when somebody writes a memoir, that's what you're going to get. I mean, they've written that. They're not going to tell you anything new. I mean, maybe if you worked on them, that you might be able to get something. But basically, they've constructed their life, they've outsourced it, and that's what they do. So, no, I mean, there are people who I very much wish that I could have been able to speak to, but it wasn't possible. Yeah.
Writing a social history is very different than writing other kinds of history. How do you do that?
A social history or a cultural history?
Yeah. So that question is writing a social history. Well, how do you do that? It's a different kind of
see,
writing.
Is it? I mean, that's the only kind of history I've ever written. So, I wouldn't. That's. I mean, I've written other books that could certainly be considered history books, but they've all dealt with culture, with with the evolution of culture. I mean, I do try and put things in here. I certainly don't treat New York as a as a vacuum. I mean, I'm very aware of things that were going on, both in in the local politics and national and even beyond that. So, for example, paying attention, making Robert Moses, like an important person. I mean, he's important because of the effect that he had on New York as a place. So I guess that's kind of social history too.
And Soho would not have turned out the way it did.
That's right.
Without everything around Moses, because it was abandoned. It was then bought up by a handful of people. Not bought up by, but there were people.
It was pioneered. Yeah,
who were pioneering, and and you really bring not only that part of New York into the picture, but also the part that Danny Lyons documents that's going to be torn. And we talk about you mentioned Ken Jacobs, the wonderful film he made.
Well,
of
Well, I'm interested in neighborhoods. I mean, and that's part. That's part of it. I mean, the West Village has a whole story as a neighborhood. I mean, Cooper Square has a story as a neighborhood. The Lower East, the East Village is an invented term. I mean, it was just the Lower East Side until the early '60s. Right. That has a story, and certainly downtown. I mean, Soho didn't have a name until to the late '60s when it the acronym was coined by some urban developers. Soho is really a kind of a miracle that it wasn't leveled, because probably in any other city it would have been gone. If you think about how the downtowns were destroyed in cities across America, that it's amazing that didn't happen. And of course the reason it didn't happen was that there was a collective of struggle that went on. And so to the degree that that's in the book, and I think it is, that's social history. I feel.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
If you had to bookend the period that you're talking about with particular dates, what would they be, and what are the conditions for this period to sort of come into being, and what makes it end or
So how did I get the dates? Okay. Well, I wanted to start, with basically, I think I wanted to start with at least with Pull My Daisy, and then other things. I realized that in 1959, a lot of interesting things happened. The first happening, Ornette Coleman at the 5 spot. Pull My Daisy goes into production. The Connection. I mean, it's an amazing confluence of things. So that seemed like a good place to start. And then Kerouac's appearance at Hunter I thought was significant because one of the things that you see in this period is that artists, project themselves as personalities. And Alfred Jarry was a personality. It's not like Americans invented this, but Americans gave it, I think, a particular kind of push. And so that even though Kerouac sort of disappears after that first chapter, I think he's and I certainly like some of his writing. So, but I think that he's important as a figure for having put himself out there. And this incident in at Hunter College was a great example of that. So I started with these basic things, and I do think also one of the ideas that I had was that starting with happenings is that as the book goes on, happenings move out from the galleries and lofts and into the streets, so that by the end of the book, you have the New York Times, a writer for the New York Times wonders if Abby Hoffman is like the Shakespeare of our era, and she's being provocative, but the fact is that happenings were politicized. That was the form that really became politicized at the end of the 60s. So to me, that's a through line. Now, why did I end it when I ended it? This is for personal reasons, because I had been away. I came back to New York. I saw Flaming Creatures when it had its first showing in many years. I was really knocked out. I wrote it up, and I just sent it into the Voice. And I think that probably I would have sent it to Evo, but they were like in the process of dying. So I sent it to the Voice. Then, no warning, it suddenly turns up, like 5 weeks later, in the Voice, this article. And of course, I had very mixed feelings about this, because my friend said, "What, he wrote for that sellout paper?" You know what I mean? I didn't know how to handle my little brush with notoriety. But anyway, I thought that was a good place to end, because as I came to realize that was the seed of this book. And after that point, I was I wouldn't say that I was a particularly significant person in this scene, but I was on this scene. So, I did know very much what was going on at that time. And so there's none of the belatedness which might characterize the earlier part of it, So that I figured I'm going to stop at that point.
So that'll be another book?
It's too soon to think about that.
Too soon.
Yeah.
Well, all right. So I think you're going to sign some books, so as we finish in the spirit of Jack Smith, since we have a full moon, it's a lobster moon.
Oh, that's right, the lobster
we can
moon.
enjoy.
Yeah.
And thank you all. And
thank you,
Jim. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It really is.